Hello, friends. Alleluia. Christ is risen. This is Pastor Christopher Murundi of the Lutheran Institute of Regenerative Agriculture here on the second half of our webinar with Mr. Joel Salatin. Joel Salatin is a farmer in Swope, Virginia. He is the author of numerous books, and I think we'll try and put a link to some of those books in our description of the show page today. We had a first half-hour webinar discussing the Christianity and stewardship and how Joel approaches stewardship of the land from a Christian perspective, laid a wonderful theological foundation for what we're going to talk about now, which is a little bit more of the nuts and bolts, kind of what does this look like in action in a few different things. And I've got some questions that I've always wanted to ask Joel that we'll kind of unpack as we move along. So the first how I want to start out the second section, Joel, is to simply have you unpack just a little bit more. You started out with it on our very first question on the first webinar, but what are the techniques? How do we build? And this is building off of right from where you left off on the last one. If we want healthy soil to build healthy plants, to healthy animals, to healthy people, how do we do that? What are the steps? What are the methods that we can use to do so? And I would especially want to know how can even the smallest of scale farmers, the backyard homesteader, to the person who has 10 acres, to the one who has 100, to even bigger operations like your own. I assume the principles are fairly similar. How do we go about that? What can we do to build our soil and make healthy soil again?
Sure. Well, it's there are several little factors. So let me just run kind of checklist here. The first one I would say is the nature certainly has annuals. So perennial is a plant. An annual is something you have to replant, like corn, watermelon, whereas a perennial would be like, your lawn grass. Okay. So the energy flow of a perennial and an annual are very different. A perennial tends in its root system in the ground so that it can withstand, droughts and blizzards and hot and cold and all that. Whereas an annual extracts from the ground and puts energy in a seed, a fruit, something up, a squash, watermelon, whatever, and it doesn't have to weather extremes in the ground. It depends on move forward, and so that's why nature is primarily perennial. And so the first thing is to put more of our ground into into perennials rather than annuals. And when you realize the American, the U.S. Farm Bill incentivizes 6 annuals, you realize that our entire Farm Bill incentivization program incentivizes annuals to the detriment of soil, not perennials to the abundance of soil. So concentrate on perennials rather than annuals. Next is integration rather than segregation. So rather than segregating, our fertilizer comes from here, our feed comes from here, our animals are locked up here, and we process over here to sell over here. What we want is to take all those things and integrate them as tightly as possible so that they're integrated rather than segregated. What we've done right now is with concentrated animal feeding operations, also known as factory farms, we've created a blessing of manure and created it into a toxic liability because it's too much in one place. But if you democratize it and spread it around in a decentralized, integrated approach, suddenly all that becomes a blessing instead of a liability. Next is we direct market rather than a commodity market. That may not seem it's related to soil, but what it does allow is for us to get off of the scale treadmill. I'm sure, Christopher, you hear farmers talk about, well, the middleman makes all the profits. The middleman makes all the money, and middleman. Well, as a small farmer, I can't beat it on volume, but if I wear the hats of processor, marketer, and distributor, in addition to my producer hat, so I could get retail dollars, now suddenly I don't have to push everything so hard because I'm getting income from other aspects of the food chain and not just the production end, which gets me off of that treadmill, and creates a little bit of forgiveness in the on the production end. And finally, I would say on this answer, what we want is, now we're in livestock here primarily. So what we want is for a pasture-based thing, so that animals move. So that animals are moved. I mean, one of the neatest things about animals in nature, you ask, well, why are there so many animals in nature? Well, one of the reasons is because in normal gravity flow, carbon, sticks and leaves and dried grass and stuff, carbon and soil tend to move downhill gravitationally. They tend to move downhill. So the animals, and even the predator-prey relationship, it allows animals to harvest things in low fertile valleys, and then walk or fly up to high ground to watch out for predators. Okay. But that's where they urinate and they poop, and they're carrying this gravitational fertility in the lowland back up to the highland through the choreography of predator-prey relationships. And so that has been a historical service. It's been a historical function of animals, including domestic livestock, throughout history. And so these are just basic principles that we see in nature, and that's what we want to try to emulate on our farm.
So the question, and you just touched on it a bit, and so let's dig into it a little bit further here. Um, can this kind of farming actually be profitable? And you talked about eliminating the middleman, so I assume that's going to be a big part of the answer to that.
Yeah.
And certainly you can point to and say, well, of course it's profitable. Here's farm A, B, C, and D that I can point to and say it's profitable. Okay, fine. But certainly, there are examples out there that can easily point to. Well, why are they profitable? How have quote unquote farm to table or direct marketing farms, what advantages do you have, and the method of farming that you've chosen, which is good for God's green earth? How is it also helpful for the bottom line? And just like your family eventually did, ditch the town jobs and do this thing. Can it be profitable, and how, and what factors make it so?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm going to start by saying, I'm not sure that this is inherently more profitable, or there are certainly profitable, chemical-based industrial ag farms, and there are profitable farms like ours. So this is the profitability has a lot more to do with actual business acumen than it actually does on a lot of other things. Now, that being said, I will tell you that when Putin invaded Ukraine and fertilizer, went up 400%, it didn't affect our farm at all because we don't buy any fertilizer. And so we have seen. So I will say that that I believe, especially in unsettled times, we are less vulnerable. We're less fragile. You could say we're more resilient, or we could say this is a more forgiving way to farm, because it's not as dependent on long distance supply chains. It's not as dependent on petroleum. we don't burn nearly as much fuel per dollar of income. The average farm in America, roughly 50% of their expenditures are petroleum, and on our farm, only 5% is petroleum. So there are some pretty big things. We have very low capital costs. The average farm in America, it takes roughly $4 worth of depreciable infrastructure, that's buildings and equipment, to turn $1 in annual sales. In other words, if a farm is generating $100,000 in annual gross sales, it's going to have $400,000 in equipment and buildings to do that. Our ratio here is 50 cents to a dollar. So that's an 800% inversion of that. Now, our labor cost is higher. So let me just quick, before you think this is too good to be true, we substitute labor and management for pharmaceuticals, equipment, and high energy capital costs. And again, coming at it from a biblical standpoint, we believe that a people-centric mindset is truly the heart of God. Nothing has tried to get rid of people more dramatically than American modern farming. Modern farming is all about how few people are on the farm. We don't want people to farm. In fact, even as a culture, we've marginalized farmers to the margin, and to where, oh, are you smart, have brains? Well, then you need to go become an IT specialist, a doctor, a lawyer, a white collar professional. Only D students and flunkies, become hillbilly redneck farmers. And so, as a culture, we have taken this sacred vocation, this noble sacred vocation, and we have marginalized it to the edges of disrespect and condescension within the culture. And so I'm getting a little bit on the rabbit, is that if we develop a centric program, we believe that what we need are more people involved in direct land stewardship, not fewer. We believe that our culture actually would be richer if more people knew where an egg came from, or knew where milk came from, or knew that salsa doesn't grow on the salsa tree. The level of, think about this, the level of food ignorance in our culture is a direct result of fewer and fewer farmers on the land. So we don't apologize that our labor bill is higher. We don't apologize for that. But we don't spend any vet bills. We don't buy any pharmaceuticals. We don't buy any vaccines. We don't buy any chemical fertilizers. We buy way less petroleum, but we do invest in people.
Well, and friends, that's really what Lyra is about, is what Joel was just saying, that getting people to know where their food comes from. That's really one of the biggest reasons why we're doing what we're doing out here in Southwest Iowa. And so we are in Southwest Iowa, and you're in Virginia. We're both, I can see the water tower of Shenandoah down the road. So we both have Shenandoahs in common, but much different Shenandoahs. I don't know that I've ever heard you address this question before, but of course you give a lot of interviews, Joel, so it's probably around there somewhere, but I'd love to hear this. Um, how do your methods that you've developed out there in Virginia, how do they transfer to other parts of the country, other climates, other geography? Um, and so I would ask you maybe to give the case that they do, if you believe that, and I assume that you do. And then, if so, what kind of modifications, adjustments, what should people be looking at in their own farm? That Sean and Beth Doherty, who I might try and reach out and see if I can get them on the program. Uh, they, they said one time I heard them say, you got to get to know your own farm. So every farm is going to be different. Um, how are your methods applicable, and what kind of adjustments might need to be made or thought about in order to do that, say in Southwest Iowa, which is, we still get a decent amount of rain here, or Southwest Nebraska? The last two farmers I talked to have been saying in drought for the last several years. So how would you respond to that?
Sure, sure. So the first answer is easy. These principles apply everywhere in the world, and they have been used very successfully every place in the world. But of course, every place has its own. There's no paradise this side of eternity, so every place has its asset and its liability. And I mean, for example, in very dry areas like Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Idaho, in those very dry areas, um, the grass, you don't get as much grass growth, but grass does not deteriorate when it grows. It stays highly nutritious and palatable for a long time. Here, where we have higher humidity and where you are, the grass grows more, but it also deteriorates much faster with humidity desiccation. So, so our cows need to eat about twice as much pounds of material as they do in Nevada, because ours are washier, waterier, greener, and less mineral, less energy. So those are the kind of changes. Another change might be the source of carbon. Some places grow trees better than other places. So, for example, in like I met a farmer in Ontario that does our composting program with deep bedding in the wintertime in the hay barn. He doesn't have trees on his farm. What he does is grow a couple of acres of real 8 foot tall long stemmed rye. He bales that up and uses the rye as the straw, and then uses the pigs to churn it up and make the compost. And so he uses rye instead of, we use wood chips from trees, because we're in Appalachia with all these hardwood trees around. And so those kind of adaptations, but every place on the planet responds to carbon. I mean, the soil is built with carbon, organic matter. I don't care whether you're on the sands of the beach, or Siberia. Okay, the soil responds, and so organic matter is good. The soil responds to perennials. It responds to animals with perennials. That's why you see so many, so many herbivores. The every place on the earth is full of herbivores, from wildebeest on the Serengeti to the American bison to caribou in Alaska. And what they're doing is pruning. They're pruning vegetation to freshen it up, like you'd prune a vineyard, grapevines in a vineyard. Same idea. Not to kill it, but to actually freshen it up. Really, really. And so that pruning is going on. Obviously, if you're in a very cold area, our pastured chickens, okay, our pastured chickens, we're out for about 200, and we're inside for about 100 days a year. You wouldn't ever have to come inside. You could stay out year round. But in Houston, Texas, you might want to take 2 or 3 months of the middle summer off of raising the meat chicken, instead of where we raise them 6 months during the warm season. You might raise them 6 months during so those kinds of adaptations are done around the planet. But the idea of moving the animals, of a pasture-based mentality, of a carbon for agronomy program, principles are identical anywhere on the planet. And as far as water, some places have too much water. So here, we are in a 30-inch rainfall area. In Iowa there, you're probably 45 to 48 inches a year. We're at 30 inches because we're in a rain shadow here between the two mountains. And so we have gone out permaculture style and built more than a dozen ponds so that we can irrigate in a drought, and by catching surface runoff and impounding surface runoff. We're not pumping from a stream. We're enter excess runoff, from a winter seasonal runoff in the summer. So those are things that you can do anywhere on the planet to facilitate and come in as a masseuse, if you will, as a landscape caresser, okay, over the landscape, to actually tease out of it better performance than it could do otherwise.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. The last question, and maybe we'll have time for one more, but at least I want to have this question asked, and we'll see if we have time for another one. But something that I've pondered in my conversations with folks, and something I wanted to hear you address and talk about. I mean, you've talked about the factory farms and that sort of thing. How do you, in your own context, how can we act with grace and not simply be slinging mud back and forth, as we tend to do in every area of American society, it seems. How do you strive
Yes.
to be a good neighbor with those who farm very differently than you? And what do we how can we help one another? How can we help and support one another?
I would answer this a little bit like, how do you in how should a person in the faith community, let's just say a good Lutheran, how should a good Lutheran respond to people outside the faith community? And I mean, Ecclesiastes, there's a place to tear down and a place to plant, and a place to be, to punish, and a place to reward, a time to reward. And so my neighbors, I can tell you, they're wonderful, salt of the earth people. But we're on different planets. We agree on a lot of things. We agree on a lot of, I mean, these are conservative, political folks. We agree on a lot, but my goodness, we couldn't disagree more on farming. So you know what? We don't make that an issue. I know that there are neighbors who have called me they've called me a bioterrorist. They've called me a typhoid Mary because we don't vaccinate our cows, and they think that our cows are going to get sick and then make their cows sick. And so, so we just don't make it a big deal. I think the touchiest issue is, okay, so you're in the church, and and one of the elders or deacons has a Smithfield hog factory or a Tyson chicken house, and here I am, and that's touchy. And so what I've done in that case is I just refuse to get in a debate. I will tell you that I have gotten in debates with other folks in the faith community, other believers, from time to time. And here's the question that I ask diplomatically, with a smile, not judgmentally, but I ask this question: does God care? That's it. Does God care? Because and I've had a lot of positive reaction from that question. It's non-judgmental, but it for I'm convinced that most people, most believers who think that, you know, we need to be out spraying chemicals everywhere and applying chemical fertilizer and putting chickens in factory houses, um, they have never thought about if God actually cares of what they're doing. In other words, they've bifurcated their life. You know, at church, I'm spiritual. Yes, I care about forgiveness. I care about all this. But in this is not part of that. This is a separate thing. And so philosophically, mentally, you know, we segregate it. Um, and yet I would simply ask, does God care? We know God cares if a sparrow falls. He cares if you lose a hair out of your head, and I've lost quite a few. Uh, so you know, we know he cares. You know, he knew the lilies of the field. He said the lilies of the field are more beautiful than Solomon in all his glory. And so God has a pretty good handle on his physical creation. He's got a good handle on it, and he cares. I mean, goodness, the Pentateuch is full of "Don't muzzle the ox that treads the corn," and your animals are an extension of you. And if you've got a pushy ox, and he kills somebody, you know, you're liable because you didn't control the ox. You know, this notion that our physical, you know, we can thank St. Augustine for this, the poor guy, you know, who had this duality, you know, the spiritual is good and physical is bad. But that's not the way the Bible is. The Bible views it all as one and very sacred. And so we don't bifurcate it. So the question that I've asked and had good response is, does God care? And if a person is actually thinking, that question leads you down. Does God care if a chicken expresses its chickenness, if a pig expresses its pigness? Does God care if what I put on the soil kills earthworms or helps earthworms to multiply? Does God care if what I do grows soil or depletes soil? Does God care if the food I'm producing brings health, or does it bring superbugs with antibiotic resistance and give people MRSA and C. diff in the hospital because of antibiotic resistance? You know, does God care? For me, that's the pregnant question. And I ask myself too. I don't want to, you know, be a cultist here, but you know, it's a very challenging question. Does God care? And I think God cares. Let me put it this way. I think God cares a lot about a lot more things than we generally give him credit for. And if we would ask that question more often, does God care? I think with an open heart and an open mind, we might.
I think we have time. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. That's really, really helpful. I think we've got time for, yep, I just got the notice that we're almost out of time. Uh, as we close today, one of the things that we've been at the Lutheran Institute of Regenerative Agriculture pondering and talking about, and some of the speaking that I've done, is the restoration of rural community. Um, how do you see the landscape? And you're seeing this because you're talking with people, you're doing conferences and all those sorts of things. Uh, the direct marketing, the farm to table, the local food. I don't know if you want to call it a movement, but just the local food. You know, a lot more options in local food than there maybe were not all that long ago. What do you see as
Mhm.
potentially the future of rural community with those things moving forward and proliferating?
Yeah, so for sure, Christopher, I see there is a homestead tsunami going on. Um, there there is a lot of concern right now in our culture about the future. I just heard on the radio news yesterday there was a survey where they asked people, uh, how long do you think we have? And 18% of Americans think that humanity has only 10 more years to live. That's a pretty pessimistic view of the future. But I'll tell you this: that one of the sidebars of that story is if the wheels fall off or if things deteriorate, most people don't want to be stuck in the city. When those empty store shelves in 2020, in early 2020, all those empty store shelves, people were actually panicking. People have come to me and asked, "Can we buy food insurance?" Young people, that have never missed a meal in their life, and they're asking about food insurance. So there is a growing concern about the economy, about crime, about and mistrust about leadership, about voices of authority, whether it's the health officials or the Pentagon. There is just these old um, stalwart American institutions are failing to engage people in trust, and so what happens when you have this breakdown is, you see it in clogged docks, you see it in China has all the chips, you see it in, where are we going to dig the lithium to make batteries, you see it in wheat from Ukraine, you see it in fertilizer from Russia. And so thinking people, intentionally mindful, begin looking at all these things and saying, how can I how can I build resiliency in my life? And so we're seeing people come back to, I think, to rural communities so that they're near someone who knows how to grow things, build things, and fix things. Grow, build, and fix. Right now, that is a way better program than a 401k, and people are gravitating to that. So I think the answer, the local food movement, or the whole, farm to table localization versus globalization movement, has gotten an amazing shot in the arm from both COVID and from um, and from the war in Ukraine, and along with other things, crime in the cities, the defund the police movement, all those kinds of things are driving a a concern that I don't want to be stuck in the city, and I think that whole localization is wrapped up in a renewed concern. People say, how do I disentangle? How do I disentangle from the system? And so I think what we're seeing is an increased interest in resiliency and disentangling from the system.
Well, friends, that's really, again, that's what we're trying to do here with the Lutheran Institute of Regenerative Agriculture. We're trying to teach people to be resilient, to bring some measure of resiliency, um, and teaching young people how to raise their own food, and being those who can feed and fix and make things. Joel, thank you so much for being with us today, for giving of your time. today. We really appreciate it. We appreciate everything you've done and all that you've inspired, both with us here and our project here, and many others. I know when I talk about our project and they say, "Oh, kind of like Joel Salatin," I'm like, "Yes, you understand what I'm talking about." So it's that's been fun as we've gotten this thing off the ground. So thank you so much, Joel, for giving of your precious time to us today.
Oh, thank you for the platform and for your heart in this matter. We need thousands more like you. Thank you very much.
Friends, thank you very much for joining us with the second half of our webinar. If you didn't catch it, go back and check out the first half, and we'll be continuing to bring you more webinars. I've got a few more local farmers who we'll be talking with in May, and I believe we're going to have a homesteader on later this month. So we're going to continue to churn these out and continue to watch them and share them with your friends. I hope these have been a wonderful blessings for you. The Lord be with you. Have a wonderful day. Bye.